Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mindscape podcast. I'm your host, Sean Carroll. You may know from listening to Mindscape in general, or my AMAs in particular, or reading any of my books, there's something out there called the multiverse. Well, what I should say is there's an idea out there called the multiverse. We don't know for absolute certainty whether or not there actually is a multiverse out there. In fact, there are different kinds of multiverse, which I would assign different credences to taking seriously. There's a quantum mechanical kind of multiverse, which I take very seriously. There is a cosmological kind of multiverse, where literally just very, very far away, there's different pockets of space-time where things behave differently. That I'm kind of indifferent about. You know, maybe it's there, maybe it's not. There's good reasons to take it seriously, but we honestly just don't know. There's also more philosophical kinds of multiverse. The philosopher David Lewis famously advocated modal realism, the belief that every possible version of the universe is actually real in some sense. And the question of figuring out which universe we live in is just locating ourselves in the space of all possible worlds. You may also have noticed that the idea of the multiverse has moved beyond science and philosophy to narrative, to movies, TV shows, books, things like that. This is not a completely new move. Fiction writers have used the notion of a multiverse as a device for decades now, but it's gaining in popularity a little bit. Back when we had Scott Derrickson as the guest here on Mindscape, he had just come off directing Doctor Strange, the Marvel movie. The new sequel, it will be Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, which follows up on the most recent Spider-Man movie, which also investigated the multiverse idea. So it's out there, okay? We're using it. There's a new movie, which I very much encourage you to see, called Everything Everywhere All at Once, that just came out as I'm speaking this in mid-April 2022. And it's by Daniels. Daniels is the collective name for a writing, directing team of Daniel Kwan and Daniel Scheinert. And they've made this movie starring Michelle Yeoh, which has a multiverse concept in it. I'm not going to give away too much. Don't worry about spoilers here. But they use the multiverse in a very interesting way. Because look, as I know from talking about the many worlds of quantum mechanics, which is one version of the multiverse, you can talk about the Schrodinger equation and decoherence all you want. What people really latch onto is the possibility that there are other versions of yourself out there, real, people who are experiencing slightly different or very different realities in some way. It is undeniable that that's a concept that grabs us, that really makes us think about this. Some people contemplate it and reject it as terrible and dumb and ontologically extravagant. Others are sort of charmed by the romance of it all. Some of us just stick with the equations and try to make sense of them as a physical theory, but all of us are thinking about these ideas. So in Everything Everywhere All at Once, the idea is that Evelyn, who is played by Michelle Yeoh, a very famous, wonderful, just about ideal actor for this role, starts out kind of not in trouble. Well, yeah, I guess in trouble is okay. But anyway, her life is not going great, okay? There's family issues. There are issues of paying the taxes on her laundromat that she and her husband owned. There's just issues of putting food on the table and so forth. And honestly, owning a laundromat isn't that sexy or exciting. So it's a kind of life that is a little bit gloomy and struggling. And many of us can, in different ways, identify with that kind of struggle when life doesn't go well. It's exaggerated for cinematic purposes, but we all have some of that in our real lives. And then the multiverse comes in literally the way that there's different versions of the universe and all of them have a different version of Evelyn. And the gimmick, which again, I'm not spoiling anything, is that she learns how to take advantage of skills that she or versions of herself have picked up in other versions of the universe. And there's sort of different parts of the universe, the multiverse, are fighting against each other, and she has to do battle, and that's all I'm going to tell you about it. But the great thing about this particular version of the multiverse is that it's not just, ooh, look, there's a lot of weird things out there, but it makes us reflect on the real world fact that there are roads not taken. Right? That there are things we could have done, decisions we could have made where things would have turned out differently. We would have become different people. And so this is where, for me personally, the use of way out scientific philosophical concepts is at its best in telling a story, making a movie, when it's making us think about the real world, okay? It's not just amazing us with how things would have been very different if the world had been a different kind of world. It's making us think about the world we actually live in, because we all have regrets or wonder about how things could have been different had we done things differently. So both Daniels are really, really thoughtful people about everything from the philosophy and science of the multiverse to the techniques of writing and making a movie. The movie has been getting rave reviews from people all over. It's not just for us multiverse aficionados. It's something for everyone. I encourage you to go see it. And I think you're going to like this conversation because we get into a lot of things that you don't normally get to talk about with filmmakers. So it's a different perspective, and I think that it sort of resonated really, really well. Occasional reminders that we have a webpage at preposterousuniverse.com/podcast with show notes, links, full transcripts of every episode, completely searchable. And there's also a Mindscape Patreon page. You go to patreon.com/Sean M. Carroll, where you can support the podcast, get ad-free versions, suggest questions for the Ask Me Anything episodes, and get a feeling of belonging to a community of like-minded Mindscapers. So again, you can do that if you want. You don't have to. It's great if you're listening to Mindscape, whatever way it is. Tell your friends. We want everyone in the world listening to Mindscape. Everyone in the multiverse, for that matter, even if I do not get donations from elsewhere in the multiverse. At least I haven't figured out a way to do that. Maybe I should start thinking about that. And with that rather down-to-earth thought, let's go. Daniel Kwan and Daniel Scheinert, welcome to the Mindscape podcast.
Hello,
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
So you have a movie that's just come out, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and there's a lot of things that happen, but let me just start with the obvious thing, that where you begin is very mundane, right? I mean, the concerns of the movie right from the start are food, family, laundry, taxes. These are concerns that we all have. So, I mean, maybe this is just storytelling 101 and it's the obvious thing to do, but a little bit of insight into why you chose to be quite that grounded in things that we could all agree on right from the start, knowing that you're going to go some crazy places.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of people expect multiverse movies to exist in, very high concept, high like superhero type genres. And we wanted to make sure that ours started in the opposite, just because we knew how wild the rest of the film was going to be and how much we were going to ask the audience to come along for this ride and kind of suspend their disbelief. And so with this movie, we were like, let's spend a decent amount of time at the beginning just grounding our characters in a very real world that feels relatable, and also, as as many people have been putting it, mundane, because in the end we knew we wanted to find a lot of small, beautiful, profound things in that mundane quality.
Yeah, we always knew we wanted to juxtapose those things, but it did used to start, we threw a lot of things at the wall. There used to be a different opening scene where she was a physics professor doing Michelle Yeoh is teaching the students about like the waveform collapsing.
The double slit experiment. Yeah.
Oh, I'm very sad now. You've made me sad that this is not in the movie.
Yeah. So there's a whole deleted scene. And then as she's showing like the wave becomes particles, she's putting dots on the chalkboard. And then her students start giggling, and she's like, "Why are they giggling?" And she turns around, and all the dots have formed a perfect penis. And then she mutters, "Oh no, she's here!" And then Jobu walks in, and it was a whole Matrix kind of sci-fi intro. But
it's so embarrassing when that happens in class.
Yeah.
Sorry, one more time?
I said it's so embarrassing when that happens in class when you're lecturing on the double slit experiment.
Oh, yes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's hard
to, is that common?
Hard to bring the class's attention back to the equations once
exactly.
that happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of why I was asking the question, because a superhero movie, whatever, people love these, obviously, but it's not that we identify with the characters. It's that we wish we could fly or be bulletproof or whatever. Here, it's much more like these are our problems as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Totally. I mean, I think some people identify with megalomaniac white men, and those people have had plenty of movies, right, about them. Like it's mostly about a guy who's like got good intentions but is a little too egotistical. And we were like, we'll make our protagonist a little different.
A little bit different.
Are you just talking about us now? Just because that's what directors are for the most part.
But that's what like the first 7 Marvel movies were, and it's so fun that they're starting to change it up. But it was like what's Thor's problem? Too confident. What's Doctor Strange's problem? Too confident. What's Captain America's problem? He's a confident dude.
Yeah. Well, I was, look, I love Doctor Strange, and my friend Scott Derrickson, who also was a previous podcast guest, directed Doctor Strange. He was my guy growing up in the comics, but I always questioned this idea that he was somehow made humble. He was arrogant, then he was humbled. Like, he became the Sorcerer Supreme. That's not exactly a humbling experience. That's kind of a wish fulfillment experience.
Totally.
Yeah.
But then, then things do go crazy. It's not mostly a movie about paying your taxes on the laundromat. So there's a lot of places, a lot of movies you could make about paying your taxes in the laundromat, but you brought in the multiverse, some crazy ideas inspired by science fiction. Why is that a good place to go if you do want to tell a more or less relatable story?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of reverse engineered it, and we had this concept of a multiverse story where you tap into lives you could have led and borrow their skills.
Because
and then we just started
the 2 sides of that coin. That's really interesting to us is first you get some powers, which is like great for, a crowd pleasing action movie. But then on the flip side, every time you tap into a power, the double-edged sword is you suddenly have an existential crisis because you realize, how good your life could have been.
Right.
And that felt like a really fun, device to throw a character into.
Yeah. So then we talked about what character would be the most interesting one to put through the ringer. And, the more we talked, the more we got excited about being someone who's older, someone who's maybe our parents' generation, who's had more life lived, so maybe more regrets. And then we started talking about our parents and started talking about the immigrant experience because Dan's parents immigrated, and that was like even more interesting, like even more kind of color to like the past lives, the alternate lives they could have led. And then, the more mundane, the better, where we were like, oh, if it's someone who really doesn't feel good about their life right now, then this journey is going to be extra, existential for them.
But ultimately extra rewarding for them by the end.
Right. And then the goal became, to make a big flashy movie that ultimately is about how beautiful and wonderful that normal life was all along. So, we wanted to make that challenge, which we knew early on was the challenge, not too easy, and be like, no, we're going to make you love the Taxes universe. By the end, you're going to be like, I want to stay right here in Taxes universe.
My taxes. Yeah. Get them right. I just want to pause for a second to give kudos to the amazing acting in the film. Michelle Yeoh, most obviously, she was brilliant in this role.
Thank you. Yeah. We love taking credit, but we don't deserve any credit. She just killed it. She just came in and was so prepared and passionate and believed in the movie. Yeah.
And I did find online that there are a couple of interesting alternate universes where different people were playing the main character in this movie, right?
Yeah. The only 2 we ever tossed around were very early on. We were like, who are our favorite Chinese actors, and we were like, what if we could get Jackie Chan or Michelle Yeoh in our movie? So early on, we were like, talking about them. And then when we weren't sure about Michelle Yeoh, our producers were like, who could you go to, if she's busy?
And we couldn't think of anyone because we basically accidentally wrote ourselves into a corner, and we're like, this movie kind of lives or dies off of Michelle Yeoh, which was kind of a terrifying realization because we had been working on the movie for a couple of years at that point.
Yeah.
But then almost as like a last ditch effort, my brain kind of went back and then was like, well, in some ways this character was inspired by my mom. Maybe we could just cut the budget down to like 10% of the original budget.
And then the whole movie is like a prank film where these directors literally drag their mom into their movie and surround them with, pedigreed actors. And it would be more like a Jackass style, like meta film.
Yeah.
And nobody liked that idea. We never pitched it to his mom. The producers were like, that's not that's not a real idea. Don't.
Well, the reason why I wanted to bring this up, because, alternative casting is always a weird thing. We live with what the world we got, and it worked out brilliantly. And not only Michelle Yeoh, but everyone in the movie is a fantastic actor. But the movie is like you just said, it's about thinking about all the roads not taken, right? I mean, that's why it's a really, to me, a cool use of the multiverse idea, because it's not just other worlds where weird things are happening, but other worlds where you made different choices, right? It's very, very directly tied to the real world fact that we always carry around with us these questions about how things would have gone differently had we done things a little bit differently at crucial moments in our past.
Totally.
Yeah, I think a lot of people keep asking us this question of why the multiverse, why is it having a moment right now? I think a lot of people can relate to it because there's never been a time where our brains have been allowed to explore all those paths, all the potential things that our lives could have been and all the potential ways our lives can still go. If I wanted to, I could, pack my bags and move to another city and have a completely different life. And that wasn't the case, 100 years ago. And I think...
or like what's extra different is now you can go on Google Maps. Yeah. You can go on Zillow, look at real estate in any city in the world. Yeah. You can go on Instagram, figure out what it would be like to live, in any city, figure out what all your friends are doing.
There's even they talk about like dating app tourism where you literally can just change your location on your phone and suddenly you can see who is single in Malaysia or who is single in Brooklyn. And I know some people who've actually done that and then actually flew to that location just to meet one person. And so
our producer maybe did that. And then his fiance.
Call him out on a podcast. And now they're going to get married. But
he didn't go to Malaysia for like a mail or bride.
No.
He went to New York where he had
Brooklyn.
An apartment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It wasn't.
But the whole idea is that I think this movie is resonating with people, and the multiverse in particular is resonating with people because we are living in an existence that already feels like the multiverse. And that's why we wrote this movie.
That's a really cool point because, as a physicist, I think of the multiverse as being something that we talk about as maybe scientifically real in a different sense than it would be in this movie. But I had never thought about the fact that in some sense we're closer to the multiverse now in the modern world because the space of possibilities for our lives is bigger than if you grew up, as a peasant in the 14th century or something like that.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to, I don't know if you've read this, or maybe you can even prove me wrong if my research was incorrect. But when we were reading about everything about the multiverse in preparation for writing this movie, one of the things I found really interesting was one of the earliest recordings of the word multiverse being used in the English language actually had nothing to do with science. It had to do with morality and theology. It was actually written by a theologist who was lamenting the fact that he believed that there was one moral universe, like centered to everything, which was God. Mm-hmm. But then when he looked around at the secular world, he was confused by the plurality of moralities and the moral multiverse that kind of made him struggle every day. And so that's where the word multiverse came from, which is really interesting because it's kind of moved so far from there. But I feel like that's where we're living right now. We're living in a place where the internet has created so many moral bubbles and different centers of universes. And what's happening now is we're watching them collide, and we're all kind of terrified to see what's going to happen next. But to me, I think that is that's one of the more interesting things I came across while we were reading.
Well, and am I correct to? Well, let me just ask it as a question rather than just saying statements. Did scientific ideas or philosophical ideas about the multiverse inspire you at all? Or did you sort of hear them and go, and just run with it yourself? Or did you like, I think you alluded to reading about multiverse ideas.
Totally. Yeah. No, that was the other thing I was just thinking is, we're both really fascinated by science. But we only have enough vocabulary to understand like pop science books,
we're really big into like interdisciplinary study. So like it's about everything combining.
Yeah.
Science is obviously a big part of that.
And I always find like, I love like a big swing of a take on science and philosophy or the state of the world. And when it makes me start feeling emotional or kind of like sends me on a philosophical tangent. And so reading about like huge ideas of physics, like reading, Stephen Hawking's, or reading like stuff about evolution, and like is a huge source of inspiration for us, because we'll come to each other and be like, whoa, like what if, how did that make you feel when you read that, article about the, what's it called? The brain simulation. Like, what if it's more likely
the simulation argument,
brain
right?
would just form in
the Boltzmann brain.
Boltzmann brain, right? And we'll come to each other and be like, what a crazy article. And then we're kind of off to the races, kind of tossing around how that could, affect a story,
And so in this particular case, we read a lot about multiverse from every angle, because the fun thing about the multiverse is almost every single medium and every single field of study has its own way into it. Because like there's the quantum mechanics version of it, which is all about probabilities and quantum decisions and things like that. But then if you go to cosmology, that we're talking about like the infinite scale of an expanding universe that contains a multiverse even within itself. But the way I got into it was actually through linguistics. Oddly enough, I came across this idea of modal realism about 10 years ago. And I was just so fascinated by this idea of like taking the modality of language and treating every version and every variation as real, as almost as a thought experiment, and just went down a rabbit hole down that direction. But mathematics has its own version of the multiverse. I'd argue, Joseph Campbell talking about the many faces of God is another version of just talking about infinity, and again talking about the multiverse. And so like to me, the entry point is more like we're saying, is more interdisciplinary. It's about this bigger picture idea of us looking at bigness, at scale, and trying to squeeze that into a sci-fi action movie. It was really fun.
Well, I mean, this is great because much of what you just said, I could easily have said or have said before. I've written a lot about Boltzmann brains and about the quantum mechanical multiverse. The idea of modal realism is still one that even I come up a little bit short. This is usually associated with David Lewis, the famous philosopher who thinks that literally every possible world is equally real, and we just happen to live in the one that we find ourselves in. And that's I think that's a step too far for me, but maybe I'm just too down to earth. I don't know.
Oh, I mean, totally. To me, the fun thing about all this stuff is that it reminds me, like, obviously it's all rooted in some truth, but it still reminds me of the way that, our ancestors all interpreted certain truths in different directions. Like the way that they would, the ancient Greeks would watch a lightning strike and paint a picture of a god throwing lightning in anger or whatever. Or the fact that, there was probably a great flood, thousands of years ago, and every single civilization at the time came up with their own version of a story describing that flood and explaining that flood. And I feel like all of these different things, whether it's modal realism or quantum mechanics or whatever, we're all just pointing at the same thing and we're trying to understand it. And so like, to me, I believe none of it. And I also believe all of it. It's a very strange thing where it's the closest thing I have to like a spirituality or to like this idea of like a faith, because I will never be able to fully understand any of it. And so like you saying modal realism doesn't make sense is like totally fair. To me, it's just fascinating because it's another tool for pointing at the same thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I will make one point about quantum mechanics, which I try because I know that I have my friends and audience listeners out here who will care about this, which is just that, I really do believe that in my body, 5,000 times a second, there is a nuclear decay, right? There's a little bit of radioactivity, and there's a universe in which that nucleus decayed and one in which it didn't. So I believe that there's many, many, many copies of me being made all the time. I actually do believe this. But I also don't, I insist that the versions of me in the other universes are not me. They're like, they share a past with me, but it's like an identical twin. Like once we split apart, we're two different people going our own ways. We obviously have a lot in common, but it's not like things that happen to that person affect me in any way. That's the one thing that I want to make clear about my view of the multiverse. And it's perfectly okay.
I love it.
If in the film, that's not how it is.
I feel like sometimes in interviews, people have like asked us like, what's interesting about the multiverse? And they're coming at it from this like pop culture perspective. And I wish I was as articulate as you, because part of me wants to be like, well, a lot of very smart people for very valid reasons think it's real. Like it's not just a comic book thing, guys. Like it's the best explanation we have for like these tiny physics observations and like
but then it goes both ways.
There's a very good chance there's an infinite number of us, and we are living the life of a random one
of them. Yeah.
And that's mind-blowing to me. And like that was a huge inspiration for this movie, to just be like, I don't know how that makes me feel, and I don't know what to do about it, but I kind of am excited to stare at it for a few years and see if I can tell a story through that, like mind, like that just absurd but maybe real premise,
Which is why, we push, for those who have seen it, we push our character to the cognitive limits and our audience as well, because we're trying to basically touch upon what it really feels like when we treat that as real. Whatever you just said, this refreshing of our bodies, like how terrifying, how beautiful.
Yeah, but kind of how beautiful. It's like, it's a miracle that I'm like able to reach over and pick up this object right now, like and observe just one thing.
And as you alluded to before, in all this infinity of possible futures that my past self had, the one that you're focusing on in the movie for Michelle Yeoh's character is the one in which she's the worst. She came out the worst of all of them, and it's still not so bad. So I mean, that's a little bit of hopefulness in there, right?
Totally.
Yes, yeah. And it's almost, and that's almost from a place of judgment from the Alpha universe, which is sort of, if there are villains in this movie, it's probably them. And so even though they say that, I don't think we actually believe it. And I don't think by the end the character doesn't believe it, obviously. But in that moment, it's the worst thing that she can hear. And she takes it to heart, because I think a lot of people feel that way. I think a lot of people, no matter who you are or where you are in the world, they have this feeling that maybe this is the worst version of me. How did I screw up so many things to get to this point? And so I think a lot of people like laugh at that moment in the movie when the character says that. But then I've also heard people say that it's actually made them tear up because they felt so targeted almost. It's like, the film was speaking to them. And I love that, because I think if it was speaking to them in that moment, then I think by the end of the film, hopefully it really pulls them out of that and makes them believe in the future possibilities. If we are constantly fracturing out into, infinite number versions of ourselves every few milliseconds, like you're saying, that also means we are getting resets every moment. Every moment is a new possibility that we get to choose, which is really, I don't know, it's really thrilling to think about that.
Well, let me push on that a little bit. This is a totally unfair set of questions to ask, but one pushback I get when I talk about the quantum mechanical universe is that it makes life meaningless. If everything happens, then who cares about what choices I make, because there's some other universe in which I made other choices. I try to argue that, not all universes are created equal. This is a feature of the quantum version of things, where there's sort of more of you in some versions of the universe than there are in other ones. But of course, you get to cheat in the movie because you get to access all the universes at once. But what is your stance toward this sort of meaningfulness if all these infinite number of things are happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we went into the project unsure what our stance was, and that was a lot of times that's what attracts us to a project, is like is that we're gonna chew on a big scary question for a while, and
because you're right, like, the multiverse is actually kind of anti-narrative in that way, where if you have a character make a decision and in the back of your head that the other decision was also just as valid and just as realized, then nothing matters, because in narrative the character is only built off of their decisions, which then in real life is like so disempowering, or it can be so disempowering. And so we ask ourselves, can we make a multiverse movie where we lean into that and say, I'm going to make you not care, I'm going to make the character not care, I'm going to make the audience not care, and basically stare at the meaninglessness of all of their decisions, and see if we could pull ourselves out of that, because we don't believe that. I think we needed to convince ourselves that even if we are just one tiny speck in a sea of infinite other versions of ourselves, that there's something still worth holding on to in this moment.
So yeah, the answer we stumbled upon, so we figured it out, is that
this is going to be a very valuable podcast.
I mean, or the answer that we used to get ourselves out of this impossible project, and so we could actually release it, was that like too much nihilism is a bad thing, but a little bit's not so bad, and that like a lot of people are so convinced they're right, you know, kind of like Evelyn, our main character, that they're making themselves miserable. They're making the world around them, you know, maybe not a better place. And that like, there's something kind of freeing about that scary concept of, you know, this universe is a random one. And we kind of feel like that most people, if they took a step back and stared at that scary question, and then they asked themselves, do I want to be a nice person or a mean person? The answer just intuitively is like a nice one. Like, I guess I want to do good in the world. I guess I want to spend time with the people I love. Like, maybe I'll quit like screaming online at people I hate, and bake some cookies for my neighbor if I have a little existential crisis, a little healthy one.
Yeah, I don't know how deep we want to go down like the road of like morality, or just like turning this into a morality tale. But you know, because I was raised very religious, you know, evangelical, almost fundamentalist Christian, and so now I'm very allergic to like objective morality, or any kind of any way of talking about those kind of things in an objective sense is very scary to me. But I am fascinated about the fact that like for so long the golden rule was sort of like this very strong center to humanity. The idea of like treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated has been such a big part of human morality, you know, and we're watching that break down. And I think a big reason why is because the definition of neighbor has just been stretched thin. I think that was really useful back when we had communities of, you know, a few hundred people, even a few thousand people. But now when the community and the neighbors are literally in the billions, like there's no way for that rule to actually hold true anymore. And so like, to me, what Scheinert's talking about nihilism allowing us to say nothing matters, throw out everything for a moment, just hit the reset button so we can take a step back and find a new center or a new version of morality. Because you know, I think we constantly have to be updating those kinds of things as the world changes. And I think what we discovered on this movie and is being echoed in a lot of art that's being made right now, it's not just our film, is this idea. It's like the neighbor concept is I think is failing us. And so we have to just look at it instead of saying, how do we want to treat other people? It's more about the freedom that we need to be giving everyone. And so I think the new morality that I'm chasing is this idea of nothing matters. There are no rules. Let everyone do whatever they want as long as you're kind. As long as it's not hurting anyone, why does it matter? And I feel like that, you know, those things will be up to debate forever. Like who is every action hurting and to what degree, and we will always be struggling with that. But rather than being trapped in this idea of trying to police our neighbors or think of just the individual neighbor, I like the idea of just freeing ourselves up to say, don't worry about it. Yeah. Nothing matters. Just be kind.
I promise we'll get in a minute to like down to earth questions about screenwriting and movie making, but I have some deep questions deep issues I want to talk about because this
is our jam. No, we're excited.
So I'm bored of talking about movies.
I'm just going to chime in and say I still think treating your neighbor how you want to be treated checks out for me. I don't know. You know, it's like
it checks out, but it's limited now. I think it's breaking down. A little bit.
He treats his neighbors like garbage. Exactly. I never want to be like Dan.
Maybe he wants to be treated like that. Maybe he wants to be treated like
just
that.
Just throwing dog shit over the fence all the time.
I just want to be shamed and
Right.
Well, the flip side of this, is when you contemplate these gigantic multiverses, not only do you think about, is it meaningful because I could have done other things? The other worry from the existentialist side of things is I notice that I am very small inside this huge collection of infinitely many things happening. Even if it's not other me's out there's certainly a lot of other stuff out there. So I personally kind of, when people bring that up, I kind of lean on a version of the Serenity Prayer. I'm like, well, yeah, but know the wisdom to understand what you can affect and what you can't. And even if it's small, that is what matters to you, right?
Yeah, that's great, because what you just said is kind of where my brain has been at the past couple of weeks. The Serenity Prayer, just like knowing when the limits of the individual, and that's probably going to go into our next movie. I don't know. There's something there that is really profound. And our visual effects supervisor, who's a good friend of ours who worked on the movie, this morning he literally just sent me a podcast about that very thing, about the limits, the limitless expectations and limitless imagination that we have, versus the limited bodies that contain them. And like that tension is so awful.
Right.
But yeah.
And then I feel like on the other side is like, I've recently been like reading more like Alan Watts, like philosophizing. I haven't read much, but like there's something it's one of the only philosophers I've read where I'm like, oh, this kind of just adds up. It's all just like, it's not like super difficult to parse out. I mean, I guess that's what he's known for, is being like, hey, I'm going to take Eastern philosophy and make it so Westerners can understand it. But like he talks about like how it can be a really dangerously upsetting thing to really focus on the self as something 100% separate from the rest of the world. And that it's a porous thing, like there's your consciousness. Is that the self? Or there's your body. Is that the self? Like, but the food in your stomach is not the self, or maybe it's just this
becoming the self,
but maybe it's this like
more
porous thing that like you control some, but like you control it less and less the further it goes out. But also like Dan is a part of me, like my community is a part of me. And like, the universe, as huge as it is me. And that there's something kind of like beautiful about that, where it makes you feel less shitty about being so tiny. And then you're like, I love redwood trees. Good thing those are
a part of you?
Part of me, because I'm part of Earth. Pretty cool. I get to high five the redwood tree and be like, I look good. That's my version of Alan Watts.
But the great thing about art in general is it can take these lofty ideas from science or philosophy or whatever and bring them down. Like once you have to make it manifest in the plot and characters of a story, then that's sort of what matters. Like philosophers love them. I'm kind of one myself, but you can talk in abstractions all the time, and it can often be like an extra step that doesn't get taken to make that real in people's lives. But as filmmakers, you have no choice. You're showing people doing things on the screen.
Yeah, I think sometimes we come into a project with some hot takes that we're real confident about, and then when you start having to like illustrate them with human beings and trying to make them relatable, it's like humbling, and you're like, oh, there's more nuance to this. Like the point I was trying to make is changing because I want it to feel real, and real people aren't as black and white as, my opinion, like a bumper sticker is easier. And then like, so even while working on this project, like I think we had to put ourselves in the shoes of these characters that are our parents' generation. And like, I think at first we were a little like know-it-all-y as we did that. And we were like, and through the process of making it, we were like, it's not easy. Right. To like understand your children who were raised on the internet if you weren't raised on the internet. It's not easy to like, understand your kids' pronouns when your kids' pronouns change. Like that's hard.
Yeah.
But it's also still important. But anyway, yeah, that's what your comment kind of made me think about, is like bad art is like just propaganda where someone's screaming a hot take. But I think like, yeah, the good art, which we aspire to make, requires nuance. And you're like, oh, well, I'm having to get in the weeds here.
Well, you're giving me an idea that maybe it should be required in philosophy courses that all the students write a little bit of a screenplay to illustrate the ideas that they're thinking about, like really put it into action somehow.
I think it's a great idea.
That's amazing.
And vice versa. I think like filmmakers should have to take a philosophy course and figure out what on earth they're trying to say. Right. Otherwise, they'll just go out and just like have someone shoot a bunch of people in the forehead because it looks cool. Right. And they never think about what it means or why they made that movie.
Right. All of this is reminding me of something I read once, and I'm going to attribute it to Kurt Vonnegut, but that might be totally wrong. But
when in doubt,
Kurt
Vonnegut said it.
It's always Vonnegut. Yeah. But basically, it helped me understand our place in the world as storytellers. And basically, the idea is, in order for any paradigm shift to happen, and for any big idea to come into the zeitgeist, you need three types of people. The first one are the ones who basically come up with the idea and are treated like heretics or just like crazy people, insane people. They're the ones who have an idea so wild that the world rejects it. Then the second person you need is someone who basically looks at that crazy person and says, the first one who says, oh, wait, there's something here. This person actually is onto something. And they're the ones who validate it. They're the ones who bring them into like out from the outskirts and into society.
The podcasters.
Yeah. Exactly. The podcasters. Exactly. Yes, exactly. And then the final person that is needed is the storyteller. It's the person who can take these very complicated, convoluted, complicated, contradictory ideas that the world is not ready for, and turning it into something digestible and something scalable for society. And so after I heard that, I was like, oh, okay, I can do that. That sounds like something worthy of my time. I want to chase after complicated feelings and complicated ideas and try to turn them into something that my mom can understand, or high school kids can understand, or at least begin to understand. And so I do think, whether it's for science or philosophy or any of these fields, that the person who translates it to the masses is such an important part of all of this. And I think a lot of storytellers forget that is one of the many hats we can wear.
Yeah, there's plenty of movies out there with the shooting in the head. But I like the idea that a little bit of forced reflection might make them into slightly better movies.
It makes me think about like on the less optimistic side, Dan was, I haven't read this, but you were telling me about, I think Socrates was really anti-playwrights and anti-storytellers.
Oh, it may have been Plato.
It might have been Plato, but one of them was there's nothing factually reliable about a piece of theater. It's just emotionally effective. And then he's like, if you're trying to create like an educated populace who's trying to figure out how the world really works, the worst thing you can do is just throw art at them that's super persuasive and has no scientific method involved at all, And I love sometimes, it's like such a fun, humbling thought to be like, sometimes I could be translating something important for the masses, and other times I could just be throwing misinformation out there that's as detrimental as something the Kremlin, is cooking up, or
there's a responsibility there. Yeah, one of my recent guests, Peter Dodds, is a statistician, data scientist, but he studies uses big data to study stories and narrative, and his motto is never bring statistics to a story fight. It's just not going to be a fair fight. The stories are always going to win.
That's such a bummer. Yeah, because I think about that a lot. Because we started off we've been thinking about it a lot in the last few years, that our work early on was just us dancing with the algorithm. What kind of short film can I make that YouTube will like? And we weren't spending much time thinking about what the difference that might make in the world. Yeah. And then sometimes you look back and you're like, oh, I accidentally spread misinformation. Even if it's just representation in media, right. You can do the statistics and you're like, 20% of people look like this, but 100% of the people in this movie look like this. But also like, like our obsession with serial killer stories makes us think there's more serial killers than ever when homicides are way down, or that there's child predators everywhere, but it's way down. And it's like, oh, that's not, I love statistics, and sometimes I have so much guilt about being a filmmaker.
Well, as a scientist, as a physicist who lives in Los Angeles, I've consulted on a bunch of films, including a bunch of Marvel films. And, I'm very much of the opinion that I'm not going to object to the laws of physics being broken in the movie. Like, what is the point of that? But there's still a little voice inside of me that sometimes squeals or gets annoyed or something like that. So I'm only going to do one little, I'm going to let you know, I'm going to let you in on the one part of a kind, not just your movie, but movies like this that I can't quite stop thinking about just to get your reaction to it, which is just the fact that infinity is very big. When you talk about an infinite number of things that can happen, most of them are either terrible or boring. Right? I mean, the vast majority of universes out there don't have us in them at all, not just like other versions of us. And oftentimes when people portray, like Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide, right, the infinite improbability drive, they portray other possibilities as kind of cute and fun. And there's an example in your movie where you do this also. And so, is it just forget about that, we're telling a story, we're going to have fun, we're going to be cute? Or do you contemplate the idea that, in the vastness of infinity, most of it is terrible and boring?
Yeah, no, that's my pet peeve too. And it was kind of, hard to grapple with. And we threw a lot at the wall.
We nod to that a bit. There's a universe where life doesn't, and the conditions weren't right to form or whatever.
And that most of them are like this. But then it turns out that universe, they're still talking.
You still made it cute. It was still cute. It was my favorite part of the movie, but it was still adorable.
Oh, great. Thank you.
But yeah, you're right. There is that tension between what is accurate and what is going to help the story. Yeah. And I think for the most part, the universes that we picked were the ones that would collide with the protagonist the best. Right. And so, a lot of it ended up being the wilder ones, which is kind of interesting. And we kind of maybe we'll do a sequel that's like all boring universes. It's just universes that are just like so mundane and nothing's happening.
Yeah, yes, nothing's happening forever.
Get Philip Glass to do the score. I think it'd be great.
But yeah, we wanted to start with something extra accessible and cute, and be like, oh, what if there was one other universe? And like from very early on, we were like, we're going to introduce more and more. The audience is going to get a little stressed out. And then we're going to pull the rug out and we're going to introduce a stupid number of universes to kind of point at infinity, almost like an exponential curve of universes, for our movie. Knowing like there was no logical way we could film, like there would be limitations of what we could film and also what would be, interesting at all to look at. But hopefully people leave our movie and they can tell that we were pointing at even more universes than what we showed, like and that like ours is a cute version of the physics, because and I'd love nothing more if people took that germ of a feeling and went off and actually
did some research,
read into it more, because it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, this brings up a filmmaking point, because once you've granted yourself access to the multiverse, you can be as silly as you want, as weird and bizarre and shocking as you want. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I get the feeling that you enjoy that freedom. How much do you have to pull back and say, no, that's just too silly or too gross or too off-putting, versus, yes, let's shock the audience just a little bit.
Totally.
Yeah, it's a constant debate within ourselves. I think we're always trying to surprise ourselves, because if we surprise ourselves, then we surprise the audience, and like what better gift to give an audience?
And we get bored easily, so we try to make a movie that would not bore us.
But then we're always, with every new ingredient we add, we're always doing the calculation in our head of like, okay, what percentage of the audience are we going to lose if we include this element that's too far?
And like, how important is it to the main character's journey? And that kind of became the back and forth.
Yeah. But the most shocking thing about all of this is, we're used to our movies cutting out a certain, pushing away certain audience members because it's too much, it's too weird, it's too, aggressively strange. And that's why we're always doing these calculations in our heads. And so we expected certain people to, walk out of this movie being like, that was not for me. But I think something has happened in the time since we started making this movie where the world has just gotten so weird and the world has gotten so chaotic. You read headlines and they feel like a parody website is writing these headlines, but they're real. These are actually happening. Real life feels absurd. And for some reason, audiences are really embracing this movie way more than we ever expected. The fact that we're even on this podcast right now is very funny to me because this is not what we were imagining when we set out to write this movie. We thought we would find some interesting weirdos like us who would enjoy this, and that would be that, and we would be happy with that. But this is kind of proof that something has shifted, and the world is ready for art that reflects life. And right now, life is absurd.
That ended up being our excuse for keeping a lot of the most shocking stuff in there was that the internet is shocking, and that like, in a lot of ways, this movie's in conversation with how it feels to live online these days. And even our parents' generation is spending more time online than ever and is more aware than ever of just how like you can scroll between something that makes you like smile to something that disturbs you so quick. And we wanted to we wanted to do that justice a little and be like, our generation grew up on the internet, like that. There's sexual content around every corner on, and so like, we were like, there should be cuss words and sex toys in our movie, even though that's going to make our, moms disappointed with how, where our film school tuition went. But it felt, authentic.
I mean, it's another good point. I haven't really thought about this enough, I guess, but just the fact that not only do we have this technology now and it's changed our lives in certain ways, but one of the ways is the whiplash, the rapidity with which we can be pushed from one thing into another. Like, I don't know about you, I grew up with 10 channels on the TV and, some books that, and you're in any one book for a long time. But with thousands of channels on TV and literally millions, billions probably of websites out there, you can get this sort of conceptual, emotional, feeling of just being just chaos at a very, very rapid rate. And I guess that is partly what is being reflected in the film.
Yeah, it's wild. Like, I think people have always loved camping because you kind of calm down. But, I'm not that old, so I can't speak for what camping was like in the 80s. But I feel like when I go somewhere and my phone doesn't work for 2 days, like, it is wild how different I feel and how my brain feels. And it's like only when you get off the drugs do you realize just how
bad it was.
Different life feels when you don't take your drugs. But it's like that.
But
my phone.
The movie, I think the people who really click with this movie are the ones who immediately understand that the whiplash that you're feeling is intentional. Yeah. I think some people watch it and they aren't ready to let go. And it's a lot. It's almost abusive to the audience, this movie sometimes. Of course, we took a lot of care in making sure that the abuse was rewarded. But once you let go and realize the whiplash is intentional, you are ready for this roller coaster ride. And we use a lot of genre and we use a lot of like really quick, snappy filmmaking techniques to make it apparent. But it is fun to be sitting in an audience with a bunch of people, and some people are laughing and some people are crying and some people are screaming all at the same time, watching the same exact scene, but reacting in all these different ways. And because that's what it feels like on the internet. When someone posts like a tragedy online, that's what it's like. Some people are cheering, some people are crying, some people are making jokes. It's a very strange way to exist where you're not allowed to have your own feelings about something anymore. Because the world is having it first.
Let me just take advantage of having you here, because you talked about your goals with a movie like this. How does it come together? Is it always the same, or is every movie different? I mean, do you start with the characters, the plot device, the images?
Yeah, I think we start with like throwing a lot up in the air. Like even right now, as we try to figure out what our next movie might be, we have too many ideas and too many like things about the world that are interesting us, and we're kind of always just waiting for a bunch of our favorite ones to coalesce. And it's kind of like this like aha moment that's not just one idea. It's that moment where like, oh, that project will let me do 10 of the things that interest me right now. I'm not going to get bored with that, which is the other half of my answer, which is like, we like to do things that we won't be sure if it worked, and we won't be done until the very end. Like this was like it took us all the way through mixing the movie, to refine what we were saying, and we were constantly tweaking things because we bit off something hard.
Yeah. One thing I'll say is I think we write the wrong way. I think classically you're supposed to. This is actually a metaphor that our composers used for their process, and I'm stealing it now. So Sunlux, they were the band that composed the score for this film, and they describe their process like this. They say, normally an architect will build a house, and you get the structure right. You make sure everything feels safe and sound, and then you go inside and you start to populate the house with furniture and appliances and things that make sense. But their process, which feels very similar to ours, is instead of building the house first, they might be walking down the street and come across this amazing armchair with like 10 legs, and it has leather, but also, there's some pokey parts, that stick out if you don't sit in it right, but they love it. And they say, this chair is incredible. I'm going to build a whole house around this chair, and I'm going to make this chair make sense. This chair doesn't make sense right now. It doesn't make sense in my mom's house, but I'm going to build a house where this chair makes perfect sense. And to me, I'm like, when I heard them describe that, I was like, yes, that's exactly how we work. We find these weird chairs, and we spend the rest of our time just trying to build a house around it. And I think for this movie, the chaos was the chair. Infinity was the chair. We're like, I want to build an entire thing around infinity, even if it structurally doesn't make sense or structurally doesn't follow the rules. This is going to be a very hard challenge, but a very fulfilling one if we pull it off.
I wish I'd done that with my actual house. I just did renovations, and my favorite sofa didn't fit in it, and I had to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Defeats the purpose of a house if your favorite sofa does not fit in it, really.
Yeah, it just didn't make sense in the room.
Well, I mean, maybe this is something worth explaining to people who don't make movies for a living, because I think that a lot of people presume that you have a script and then you film it, but there's still a lot of picking and choosing along the way, right? You film things that don't make it into the movie. You end up filming things that maybe weren't in the script. I mean, what is the planning versus chaos element in that process?
Totally. Yeah. I think there are filmmakers like the kind of classic Hitchcock style, is that like he would perfect his script, perfect his shot list, have storyboards, and he'd come in and he'd move around his actors like chess pieces and execute exactly what he had planned all along. But that's so hard, like with live action, and also kind of like very unpleasant, and like the opposite of why I got into filmmaking. I like the collaboration and the problem solving, and the fact that you're learning new things all along.
It's also it's self-limiting. If you're going to go in there and say, I know exactly what I want, there's no room for the universe to tell you better things, or to show you better ways of making the film that you're making. And I think a film like this would never have worked if we had gone the Hitchcock route. I think we had to be constantly listening, constantly feeling out what our crew members were saying, and what the locations were telling us, and how, just everything down to like, scheduling around different actors' schedules, like all of that is speaking to you, and you have to listen as a filmmaker, because otherwise you're just fighting against entropy, and you're fighting against just inertia, which is like impossible.
Yeah, it's like, so for example, we get all the way into like the final weeks of the edit, and there's still things that some audiences aren't latching onto about the logic of the movie, and we were still rewriting lines of dialogue to try to, and just one line of dialogue could make such a difference that would then help everyone, just help a few more people give up to the absurdity of the bagel, for example.
The bagel,
and we were tweaking those lines straight up to the end, or like there was one shot that we added to the opening of the film that's just the daughter sad driving her car, and like the simplest shot, but it wasn't in the script, it wasn't in the edit, and something about the daughter's journey felt like it wasn't set up properly, and audiences were like, why is it all about the daughter at the end? And so like I think it's a product of how much we were trying to squeeze into our movie and how ambitious our ideas are, but like we added that really late, and it made a huge difference, you know.
It's a chemistry set, and you just gotta keep tweaking those the proportions until it feels right. But to answer your question in another way, he comes from improv, I come from animation. It's animation is filmmaking when you have all the control, and improv comes from all filmmaking where you have no control. And I think our style of and our process is somewhere in the middle, where we plan as much as we possibly can, but knowing that our projects are so ambitious, we have to leave a lot of room for improv.
And also knowing that we have really talented friends and we want to leave room for their ideas. Leave room for the actors to come in and surprise us.
Well, one of the features of the film is these wonderful Hong Kong cinema fight scenes, right? And presumably those are pretty darn choreographed. But I mean, how much were you just nodding toward that sort of genre of film versus actually using the techniques that they would use to make a fight scene like that?
Yeah. Growing up, that was like all we watched in the house, because my dad loved watching movies and my mom fell asleep in most movies unless they were in Chinese. And so my dad would just constantly be finding like bootleg copies of, Hong Kong action movies and things like that. So we watched a lot of that growing up, and both of us, we both connected over the fact that we loved that kind of filmmaking style. And what was great about it for this movie is not only is it so dancerly and satisfying, and
it's our favorite, but it also happens to be not that expensive compared to the kind of like bombast of like American action movies. Like it's all about like two people fighting over a prop, as opposed to 100 people with guns as the building falls.
Right. It doesn't make it easier. In fact, I think it's much harder to pull off Hong Kong action because it requires every performer to be incredibly physically able. And then also the camera work has to be very precise, and you have to have a team who's all dedicated to this idea of shooting action kind of unconventionally. I think a lot of things have been changing in American action films, but for a very long time, the way that we shot action was the same way that we'd shoot coverage of like any other dialogue scene, where you get the wide shot of the whole thing, then you get some close-ups, and then if you need some inserts for clarity, you go and get like this foot kicking this thing, which is like way more efficient, because then you're not changing light setups constantly, you're not turning around and forcing the whole crew to move every single time you do another take. But that ends up, when you cut it together, there's a dryness to it that feels like you're shooting it as if it's a conversation, and not like a dance, not like a proper fight. And the way that in Hong Kong, Yuen Wu-ping was the legendary choreographer that did almost all of that stuff, or at least influenced a lot of that stuff. And his way of shooting would be, he would just choose the exact shot for every single move that would best illustrate the feeling and also narratively the story in that moment. So even if it was just one punch to a face, he would find the perfect shot for it and hit that punch, and then cut to a wide, and suddenly the fall would have a very specific angle that would make the fall feel very dramatic. And so even if sometimes it cuts fast, it's always very narratively clear. And then there's also these incredible moments where they just let the performers perform because they're that good. You can just hold on a stationary tripod shot for a decent amount of time and just be impressed by how incredible these athletes are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the last thing in our Hong Kong spiel we like to say is that we referenced it so heavily, tried so hard to make something that could stand up to like Michelle Yeoh's career.
Yeah.
And then we tried to not hurt anyone. And so the difference was when we did our action scenes, we had very thick wires and we just removed them in post. But like classic Hong Kong action movies, they used thin wires that the camera couldn't see. And it's so dangerous. And like,
and a lot of people got hurt. Yeah.
And a lot of people would get hurt on those movies. And so we're happy we found a safe way, to do that style. Because we did not want to hurt Michelle Yeoh, our hero.
And that's compatible with the underlying lesson of the movie, I guess, which maybe makes this a good last question to ask. Is there a lesson to the movie? Is there a moral to the story? And should movies have morals, or is it just not, I shouldn't say just, but is the goal more to give people a bunch of ideas to think about and come up with their own stories? I mean, how pat should the lesson be at the end versus a little bit of loose thread chaos left hanging there?
Totally. Yeah, I think we're always searching for a balance in there. And I'm not sure what the right vocabulary words are, but like, we have a very concise moral to the story that's so simple it sounds like a children's book, which is like it's chaos, be kind. But on top of that, we tried to make every character's journey nuanced and explore things that didn't have super black and white answers, and leave room for everyone to kind of see what resonates with them when they leave the theater, and not end the movie with someone walking off into the sunset happily ever after, so that like hopefully there's things to chew on that are gray, and that it does feel like the movie's out of our hands now, and we read think pieces online and we're like, whoa, I guess the movie means that. Like, cool. Which is such a fun experience.
I think that's all a product of the fact that like we don't go into every movie with a moral. We don't know what the moral is going to be, if there is going to be one at all. And hoping, we just kind of enter every project hoping that we will find something that we can learn. And if we're learning, then the audience is learning, and that's exciting to us. And so I think that's probably why, people have a hard time pinning down what this film means, is because it grew into its meaning rather than us placing some seed of meaning at the beginning, which I think is like in my, my experience, those are my favorite kinds of films, is where it feels like the filmmaker is searching, the filmmaker is looking for something rather than trying to teach something. I like reflecting back on a lot of our work. I feel like oftentimes the characters are, all the worst aspects of our characters are the worst aspects of ourselves as writers and as humans. And we're putting those people into these movies so that we can hopefully see a way to become a better person through the process. And that's, I think hopefully that's something that people feel.
It's like a hybrid. Our filmmaking process is a hybrid of Jackass and therapy. Yeah. Where like, we just want to do things that are fun to do and fun to watch. And we also want to like try to grow as people along the way, and maybe that'll be valuable for the audience too.
Well, and Evelyn has triumphed, but next year she's still going to have to pay her taxes again, right? I mean, there's no escape from this.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's still chaos. Yeah, she doesn't,
It's still chaos. That's the moral. It's still chaos. So be kind to each other. So Daniel Kwan and Daniel Scheinert, thanks so much for being on the Mindscape podcast.
Well,
such a pleasure.
Us. Wow. This is. I hope we didn't say anything too stupid.
Next time we're going to interview you. I know.
We have more questions for you.
Yeah.
I have answers. Some of them will be crazy. Some of them will be wrong, but I'll give them.
Great.
Maybe we should consult or ask you to consult on our next movie. Honestly, now that we've connected, this is very exciting to us.
You know how to get me. Yeah, love it. All right. Thanks very much, guys.
Well, thanks,
Cheers.
Sean.
Nice to meet you.